Good morning. It's Monday, March 3rd. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 514 days old. Ramadan Kareem to all those celebrating. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, we're watching some news out of Haifa this morning. A stabbing attack has been reported, at least one killed. More on that, I'm hoping not that much more, but we'll be learning throughout the day. For now, I think we need to say right up front that we're right back on the brink of war, folks. Phase one of the ceasefire is over. There are attempts to keep things limping along in what Israelis are calling phase 1.5, but Hamas is digging in its heels. So are Hamas's patrons in Qatar. The terror funding regime in Doha came out slamming Israel yesterday. By contrast, the Trump White House is seemingly behind Israel's offer to continue the ceasefire until after both Ramadan and Passover conclude. But it's all a bit chaotic. Then again, so is war. We'll continue tracking all of it right here on the FTD Morning Brief because, well, that's what we do. Our guest today is Henri Barkey, an adjunct senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bernard L. and Bertha F. Cohen Chair in International Relations at Lehigh University. I've had the pleasure of knowing Henri for several years now. All I can say is this: Henri is one of the smartest Middle East observers I know, but his best stuff usually focuses on Turkey and how it fits into the regional puzzle. We caught up last week for a pre-recorded conversation, which we'll play for you in just a few short minutes, so hang tight for that. Everyone's talking about that White House meeting between Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and Vladimir Zelensky on Friday. We all know what happened. What should have been a perfunctory photo op turned into an unmitigated diplomatic disaster. You probably know by now that my FDD colleagues and I view Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan as three embattled democracies that are equally deserving of American support. The fates of these countries are more intertwined than many realize. But let's be real. America is deeply polarized. It almost doesn't matter whether Trump has legitimate reasons to chastise Zelensky for being an ungrateful ally. This spat is rooted, at least in part, in partisan politics. Support for Ukraine since the 2022 Russian invasion has enabled the Ukrainians not to lose, but it hasn't been enough for them to win. Somehow, this stalemate became a pillar of Democrat foreign policy, and that didn't sit well with Trump, who has never been shy about shaking things up, especially when it comes to the policies of his predecessors. Israel needs to learn from this moment. We all saw the tensions between Israel and the Obama White House, and while this friction was somewhat less obvious under Biden, things were still complicated. The so-called progressives tripped up the U.S.-Israel alliance more than once since 10-7. If this trend continues, there is more danger on the horizon for Israel. Now's a good time to engage with Democrats. I hope the Israelis see that, because it's not hard to imagine a different clash in the Oval Office with different leaders. Now for your headline. Headline one, the IDF says it is ready to defend an endangered Druze community in Syria. On Saturday, Israel's defense ministry said it had instructed the IDF to prepare to defend a Druze majority suburb of Damascus called Jaramana from attacks by the al-Qaeda regime in Syria. Clashes erupted in Jaramana on Friday when a member of Syria's security forces entered the area and opened fire. A firefight ensued and left the gunman dead. The story didn't end there. More gunmen arrived in Jaramana on Saturday, and the clashes continued. Local media reported that one Druze man was killed and 9 others were wounded. Israeli Defense Minister Katz warned that if Syria's new Islamist leaders harm the Druze, they'll be harmed by Israel. This was definitely not on my bingo card on October 7th, 2023. It wasn't even on my bingo card on October 7th, 2024, for that matter. We're all just trying to keep up here, I suppose. Headline 2, Lebanese authorities detained a man at the airport in Beirut on Friday. Get ready for this. The guy arrived in Lebanon with $2.5 million in cash for Hezbollah. And where did it come from? Turkey. Lebanon's finance ministry said the cash will be handed over to the investigation division at the General Directorate of General Security. That's a lot of generals. The bankrupt government of Lebanon could probably use that cash. This incident certainly has my attention. As my colleague David Daoud noted, the seizure seems to reflect a desire by Lebanese authorities to restrict the flow of money to Hezbollah, but it also may be a bunch of bull fertilizer. The government in Lebanon wants to show the world that it can take care of its own security and that Israel should completely withdraw from South Lebanon. So let me just put it plainly here. Israel's not leaving Lebanon because of one financial interdiction. We need a lot more of those. And we need to see the Lebanese armed forces dismantle Hezbollah. And that will happen when the Taliban sends a female basketball team to the Olympics. Headline 3, the Trump administration is expediting the delivery of some $4 billion in military aid to Israel. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced the move on Saturday. He said that he used emergency authorities to speed up the deliveries as Israel braces for a possible return to conflict in Gaza, if not other fronts across the Middle East. Rubio didn't disclose what's included in this multi-billion-dollar package. The previous day, the State Department did notify Congress that it plans to sell approximately $3 billion of weapons to Israel. State notified Congress of 3 separate future sales, including thousands of bombs, Joint Direct Attack Munitions, or JDAMs, those for the guidance kits for those, and armored bulldozers. The sales were notified to Congress on an emergency basis, which means they won't be subject to review by the House or Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's obviously great news for Israel, but the first deliveries aren't scheduled until 2026. I'm not sure that'll be fast enough, but the optics of full military support from the United States to Israel is a message of deterrence in and of itself. All right, it's time for that interview with Henri Barkey of the Council on Foreign Relations. We recorded this last week, but it's all still highly relevant. So top off that coffee, sit back, and have a listen to some insights from one of the top academic minds on Turkey here in the United States. Welcome to the program, Henri Barkey.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I want to just start, maybe, if you would, to tell us a little bit about the trajectory that Turkey has been on. You and I have talked about Turkey now for many years. We've been concerned about the policies of the government in Ankara. But if you would, maybe just talk about this trajectory since the early 2000s that the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, has been on.
Well, I would say that there are 2 major issues. I mean, when you think about the trajectory, yes, what you do have is a very strong leader who has managed to impose his will, his own personal will on the country. And he is very much both a populist authoritarian and also a revisionist leader in the region, in the sense that he wants to shape the region, and actually more than the region. I mean, he has grand ambitions to make Turkey, and of course, when you say Turkey, in parentheses, Erdogan himself, as a major leader in the world. He, almost from the beginning, he kind of fancied that Turkey ought to be a permanent member of the Security Council, because Turkey was a leading member of the Islamic world. And in many ways, he saw Turkey, and obviously himself, as a cut above all the other Muslim countries in the world, whether it's Pakistan or Iran or Egypt or Saudi Arabia, that Turkey was both an industrial power and in kind of member of the NATO and the Western Alliance, and at the same time had relations with everybody and had influence. But that didn't pan out because there was a great deal of resistance on the part of just about everybody. Nobody wants somebody else to assume the leadership like that. So he has tried very different tactics, sometimes cajoling, sometimes actually acting aggressively against other countries. And there was a point, in fact, when he found himself completely isolated, where the Arab world completely ignored him and literally had little to do with him politically. But when you look at Erdogan, you also have another story here. And the other story is that he is in what I would think now is almost desperate struggle to remain in power. He is constitutionally prevented from running for another term. Now, that other term doesn't start technically until 2028, so he has some time. But the 2 ways of achieving that is a constitutional change. I mean, changing the Turkish constitution and allowing the incumbent to run for a third time, or there's a gimmick whereby you call for early elections, but if you do it at a certain time, it's not the time served doesn't count as a full term. Therefore, the incumbent can get a third term. That's actually a little bit dangerous because you won't know until the last moment. But here is when you look at what's happening domestically in Turkey, is that he's desperately trying to convince the Kurds to give him that constitutional change and trying to come up with some format whereby the Kurds and the Turks will have a deal whereby the PKK and the main Kurdish organization will demilitarize. But what is interesting is here, I mean, while all this is happening, there's an amazing wave of repression going on in Turkey now. I mean, the likes of which we have not seen, in the sense that literally, if you turn your head left and look at the president like this, that can be considered an insult to the president, and then you get arrested. Right? People have been going to jail now for tweets they sent 7 or 10 years ago. This is not the behavior of a leader who feels confident about his position in society.
Yeah. And obviously, a lot of complexity here when you begin to think about the kind of delusions of grandeur of this leader, and then the deep insecurities and the repression. You're looking at a country that really doesn't feel like it belongs in NATO, certainly doesn't belong on the UN Security Council, despite everything that Erdogan has said. But no, let me ask you if we can turn to what's been happening in Syria, because in my view, and I think you've set the table well here, we all understand that we're dealing with a deeply problematic leader of Turkey. All of a sudden, we watch the Assad regime collapse, and it turns out that Erdogan is behind it. We have an al-Qaeda affiliate group, formerly known as the Nusra Front, now HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, now calling himself Ahmed al-Shara, leads this country. But as we hear, I think you've probably heard some of the same reports that I have, that there are Turkish advisors in every government meeting that is relevant right now as foreign dignitaries come through Syria to engage with this government. The Turkish lira is traded in all the population centers. We are looking right now at essentially a Turkish takeover of almost an entire state in the Middle East. So does this mean that he has more power? And then if that's true, then where we go from here?
Look, I think some of those reports are exaggerated. I think that, yes, there are parts of Syria where the Turks are in complete control, where the Turkish lira is actually the official currency. The school system is based on the Turkish system, so Turkish school books are used. But I don't think that influence really goes down to every corner of Syria. First of all, the Syrian government is not really in charge of much, right? So you have pockets and regional power centers that are not necessarily under the control of Damascus, much less Turkey. Secondly, you have to look at the success of the HTS and Shara in December as a catastrophic success for Turkey. Turkey did not necessarily want this. Turkey was supporting HTS, but had kind of difficult relations also with HTS because the Turks have their own fairly large military small army called the Syrian National Army that they completely control. Right, so that is outside the HTS's control. So it's not as if the HTS and Turks were in complete cahoots. One, two. What the Turks really were aiming at the time in December, you have to remember, was they wanted Assad to re-engage with them. They had been making these overtures to Assad, and Assad kept saying, "Forget it. I am not talking to you until you pull out of Syrian territory." Right, so this was a way of putting pressure on Assad to get Assad to the negotiating table. And remember, other Arab countries had already opened the door to Assad, so there was an attempt to bring Assad Assad back into the fold because everybody had assumed that Assad was immovable. So they pushed the HTS, but it was not without the expectation that the HTS in 8 days or 12 days will get to Damascus and get rid of Assad. So that was a complete surprise. A complete takeover of Syria by the Turks is also, I don't think, really possible because, first of all, there's strong centers of resistance. Second, I would say even the HTS and its allies would not necessarily want to have Turkish overlord because other countries in the region don't want that to happen. I mean, when you look at where the money is going to come, if money comes into Syria, it's going to come from the Gulf. And the last thing the Gulf countries want is Turkish tutelage. So
unless,
all these
unless we're talking about Qatar, of course, and that is the money that we understand is paying for the government salaries in Syria right now. And the Qataris are partners with the Turks in the promotion of a Muslim Brotherhood worldview. Am I missing something here?
Yeah, but look, Qatar alone cannot do it. Besides, remember that there are all these sanctions, international sanctions have been imposed on Syria. They have not been lifted. And there is going to be a price to lift those sanctions, right? For the United States to do it, for the Europeans to do it. Yes, they are lifting, they're allowing humanitarian goods to go through. But in terms of integrating Syria into the international financial system, the UN financial system, or for people to invest in Syria, that will not happen unless United States and Europeans decide to go along with it. And if you have a situation where you really have what you would call this Muslim Brotherhood imposition on Syria, it won't happen. But I do agree that there is a problem with the current leadership in Damascus because forget about the Turks for a moment, right? Or the Qataris or anybody else. I don't think the HTS is open to incorporating other groups into the coalition. If you think of the Kurds, who are the strongest player now in Syria, the Alawites, the Druze, the other Shia groups, right? So
right. We're talking only Sunnis and those that are affiliated politically.
Exactly.
And I think that's obviously cause for real concern. We're running out of time. I want to ask you one more question here before we let you go, Henri. The personal relationship between Donald Trump and Recep Tayyip Erdogan. These are guys that were fist bumping on the sidelines of the UN during the last Trump term. When HTS overran Syria, we got kind of a strange message from Trump where he says, I like Erdogan, but I'm nervous about what happened. What do we expect between these two men over the next 4 years?
Trump has a fascination with quote unquote strong macho leaders. But there's a way in which Erdogan is also afraid of Trump in the sense that he understands that if you get on Trump's bad side, you can be smacked. In fact, when Trump came up with his Gaza Riviera idea, it took more than 2 days for Erdogan, who talks nonstop every day, many times a day, to say anything about it, because he really was afraid that anything he said, eventually criticized. First, he asked others in his government to criticize it, but this is something that obviously is completely unacceptable to Erdogan on many different levels. But he eventually came out criticizing it, but it was not as strong and it was delayed. So you see that Erdogan is being very, very careful because of Trump's unpredictability.
Yeah. And I think that's a good thing. And I think we're going to, let's just hope anyway, that Trump has a means to keep a check on Erdogan. I think his worst impulses can be reined in if we see strong leadership or at least tougher rhetoric coming out of Washington. Henri, we're running out of time here, so we're going to have to leave it here. I want to thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Check out the latest episode of FDD's Foreign Policy, hosted by founder and president Cliff May and featuring FDD's Ivana Stradner and author Peter Pomerantsev. The three discussed the current state of affairs in Russia in comparison to the Soviet Union, highlighting how the Russian Federation under Putin bears remarkable similarities to the pre-perestroika era. It's like that old Beatles classic back in the USSR, but without making you want to dance. FDD research analyst Jack Burnham has a piece in the New York Post calling on Washington to take decisive action in response to growing threats from Moscow and Beijing relating to undersea infrastructure. Massive amounts of global data flows through cables in the ocean. Jack highlights the necessity for the Trump administration to implement a well-organized, well-funded, and strategic plan to safeguard this critical infrastructure. And finally, FDD's bright new analyst Bridget Toomey has published a policy brief on FDD's website on the recent Houthi attacks on U.S. defense assets. After President Donald Trump successfully pushed for the redesignation of the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, Bridget recommends that the United States implement a visa ban on Houthi members, impose financial restrictions on the group, and sanction any state or entity that supports or conducts business with them. Among those states, I would add here is the country of Oman. More on that from me and my colleague Ahmed in the coming days and weeks. Oman hosts headquarters for the Houthis, and that thing has to either be shut down or bombed. Those are the only choices, if you ask me. All right, enough hot air for me today. If you're craving more, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, or take a peek at our Instagram and YouTube channels, and feel free to make that tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for another gripping episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest will be the very talented filmmaker Wendy Sachs, whose latest project, October Hate, is a documentary on the surge in anti-Semitism on university campuses in the wake of 10/7. It features lots of big names such as Barry Weiss, Noah Tishby, and Deborah Messing. It also features a certain Philadelphia-born Middle East analyst with a lot of gray hair and a big mouth. The film has not yet officially been released to the public, but we will play a trailer. This should be a can't-miss episode, folks. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.